Welcome to our Think Big Series 2021, brought to you by PSG. My name is Vilola Gounden, and I am the Head of Internal Audit at PSG Consult. PSG is a leading independent financial services group with an extensive national footprint in South Africa and a presence in Namibia. We've been in operation since 1998 and pride ourselves on providing a bigger picture approach to our clients' financial needs, from asset and wealth management to short-term insurance. We offer clients access to a wide range of insurance and investment products and pride ourselves in providing comprehensive advice. Our clients benefit from access to proprietary products and solutions, as well as a comprehensive list of third-party products. The Think Big series is a collection of dialogues and leading speakers hosted by award-winning financial journalist Bruce Whitfield. We aim to bring our audiences independent insights that help them formulate their own opinions on some of our country's most pressing issues. Uncertainty and challenges continue to transpire, but armed with quality insights, we are better equipped to chart the way ahead. In today's webinar, Bruce talks to Jakkie Cilliers, Chairperson of the Board and Head of African Futures and Innovation. Jakkie is the founder and former Executive Director of the Institute of Security Studies. His 2017 bestseller, Fate of the Nation, addresses South Africa's future from political, economic, and social perspectives. His most recent book, Africa First, Igniting a Growth Revolution, released in March 2020, takes a rigorous look at the emerging futures for other African nations and the continent as a whole. Today, Jakkie shares his insights with us on what to expect for 2021 and what positives to take from 2020. Our social media hashtag is #ThinkBigPSG. The series is free, shareable, and open to anyone interested, whether you're a PSG client or not. Over to you, Bruce.
Vilola, thank you so much. If you're hoping to get an idea as to whether vaccines are arriving next week in the midst of load shedding, whether Cyril Ramaphosa's got enough power in the National Executive Committee of the ANC to ensure that Ace Magashule goes to jail, that Jacob Zuma goes to jail, or whatever you're hoping for in 2021, I'm afraid that this is probably not the place for you. Sure, we'll reflect on that, but Jakkie Cilliers' great power is the ability to take the crystal ball and gaze more deeply into it than just the short term. And Jakkie, I mean, you, again, without getting into too much of the nitty-gritty in detail, but this science, this art, this witchcraft of long-term forecasting, how do you go about doing it? I mean, give us some sense of it, because we need to believe in the process, I think, so that we can understand the outcomes and then decide whether or not we agree with you.
Yes, Bruce, thanks. I don't do predictions, I do forecasting. And forecasting means thinking about the future in a structured manner. To be able to think about the future, you use various tools. In our case, we have a partnership with the University of Denver, and they have a massive model. Algorithm, a database that allows you to look at 186 countries in Africa long term. So we use the University of Denver's International Futures Forecasting Platform, which is a database that allows you to look at any country or group of countries. And we've done a variety of work. So some of the work we've done is we've looked at individual African countries like South Africa. I published a book in Variety. We've looked at recently Algeria, Tunisia. We're doing the Horn of Africa. We've done Namibia. We've done Kenya. We've done Ethiopia, and so on. And we do thematic studies. So what is the future of poverty in Africa? What is the future of the ability for Africa to industrialize, and all of these kind of things? So that's the kind of work that I do. So it's a combination of an art and a science, but we try and root our work in data, which is quite different to the blue skies work that you often find. And we typically use two concepts that is maybe quite important for what is going to follow. The first is we refer to a current path. That is the likely trajectory of where we think things are going to pan out if there is no major shock like COVID. The second is we typically look at an aggressive positive scenario. So in the case of South Africa, we've called the positive scenario Tumamina, meaning what needs to be done to realize the Tumamina scenario. So in summary, that's what I do and how I do it.
A bit like a spreadsheet, what you get out depends on what you put in. And I suppose it all depends on what you ask the supercomputer as to what sort of models and what sort of answers it spits out.
Yes, it does. Now, increasingly, the world has become, data improves every year. And it is amazing what you can measure. For example, you can forecast governance. You can forecast democracy. Not because you have any particular insight, but if you look at the deep trends of where, for example, the 3 waves of democracy have gone, you can be fairly certain, and you look at the trends in Africa, that the general thrust of democracy over long time horizons will continue in spite of China, because China is the outlier, despite its huge size. So it's much easier to do long-term forecasting than it is to do short-term forecasting. I can tell you with a fair degree of certainty where Africa and the world is headed if there is no major shocks, but I can't tell you what the weather is going to be like tomorrow or what the interest rate is going to be.
And you'd be wrong anyway, because everybody is always wrong on that stuff. Give me a sense of it. This time last year, so end of January 2020, we were all looking ahead towards the promise and the optimism that 2020 was going to bring. There was a little bit of a niggle. People were dying in China, but that had happened before. And we would have had this conversation, and you would have proposed a forecast that would probably look fundamentally different to the forecast that you will propose today, based on the experience of the last 12 months, which has been like nothing else we've seen in 100 years.
That's very true, Bruce. And so I'm going to share a screen with you and show a graph that would demonstrate exactly, amongst others, the impact of COVID and exactly how wrong we were. It's a bit complicated, I know. At the bottom is time from 1991 till 2031. On the left-hand side is constant US dollars. And then we have a line at the bottom that shows the forecast of South Africa's GDP per capita from 1991 until 2020, which is the dip, and then a forecast till 2031. So the solid green line is what has happened to South Africa. And there is a light, I'm colorblind, but there's a light green line on top of the solid line at the bottom, which is the pre-COVID growth forecast. So pre-COVID, we were expecting significant growth in Africa's GDP per capita. But what has happened is we saw in 2020 a dramatic reduction in GDP per capita. And in actual fact, if you look at the solid line going out to the right-hand side of the graph, you will see that we never, in actual fact, make up for the hammering that we got from COVID. There is a dashed line that indicates what could be possible under our Tumamina growth scenario. So instead of South Africa growing at about 2.1% on average from 2021 till 2031, we could be growing at an average of about 3%. And now the top line is in actual fact other upper middle income countries, which is the best way in which you want to compare South Africa with the rest of the world. You take countries that are more or less at the same level of income and education. South Africa is an upper middle income country. And you can see the same story. You can see the dramatic impact that COVID has had on all upper middle income countries. And you can see that in actual fact, whereas the rest of the world is going to be growing at an average rate of 3%, South Africa only grows at an average rate of 3% if it does structural economic reform. And then there's a diagram that shows that if we do structural economic reform, we get back to our 2014 GDP per capita at around 2024. Now, South Africa's GDP per capita peaked in 2014. Since 2014, we've been going backward. A variety of reasons, one of them called President Zuma. So that, in summary, is a story of the impact of COVID and how wrong we were at the end of 2019 when we looked at where we would have gone had it not been for COVID.
And it's actually a bit of a depressing picture, because the picture suggests that the rest of the world, South Africa, just gets left further and further and further behind, no matter what we do.
Yes,
That's concerning.
Yes, Bruce, there's something that you've picked up that I haven't mentioned. There is a bottom left that says average 87%. That average is what South Africa's GDP per capita used to be as an average compared to the GDP per capita in other upper middle income countries. Now, recently, in 2017, 2018, it's about 76%. The story of South Africa is one of growing divergence between the GDP per capita in our competitors, our peers, not competitors, other upper middle income countries. We are falling further and further behind countries that have the same levels of education, the same levels of democracy, the same quality of infrastructure, and that is hugely concerning.
Is there a fix? I mean, one would assume that there is a fix, because nothing is broken in perpetuity. One looks at the post-World War II reconstruction of Germany, of Japan, for example, and the huge industrial booms that they enjoyed then, right through to the present day. Nothing is broken forever if you make the right decisions. You're implying on one hand that if we take dramatic structural reform, and ANC government is allergic to that, then perhaps we could fix it. On the other hand, you're suggesting it's unfixable. Which is it?
No, it's not unfixable. Nothing is unfixable. And if we look at South Africa's long-term growth prospects, there was a period under Thabo Mbeki that South Africa grew very rapidly. We undertook our own structural reform program that you would know very well, GEAR, and we grew. So we've done some forecasts on where South Africa could be. We called the positive scenario Tumamine. Here are sort of two of our publications. And what we did is we modeled the impact of 6 interventions in the future of South Africa. And we combined them in a positive Tumamina scenario. We intervened in health, we intervened in education, electricity, modern manufacturing, investments in economic freedom, and then land, agriculture, and water. I won't go into the content of each of the scenarios. And then we looked at what their combined impact will be. Now, this graph shows the contribution that each of those scenarios makes to GDP per capita in South Africa from 2020 until 2040 in this instance. So at the bottom, you can see the contribution that education makes to GDP per capita. So this is the increase that you get in GDP per capita from each of those scenario components. The biggest contribution comes from manufacturing. The second largest contribution comes from energy, because we have a huge energy problem. And these give you an idea of what could be possible. And if I go back to the previous graph that I showed you, remember that there were 2 lines on that graph on South Africa. South Africa is the bottom green line. There was the solid green line, which is our current trajectory, which is a growth path of about 2% on average out till 2031. And the top dashed line is what we think is an aggressive but doable, achievable growth forecast, which is about 3.1%. All that will happen is that South Africa no longer falls further and further behind its peers, and then over longer time horizons will start catching up. And there we will start reducing that gap that I spoke about a little bit earlier.
None of what you point out is new. It's not rocket science. It's just that economists have been talking about and talking about and talking and talking and talking and talking about and talking about some more for the last decade and more. Governments, you will read budget speeches, you'll see all of those issues come up. Yeah. You'll see States of the Nation speeches come up. All of those issues come up as, well, this is very important. We're going to do X, Y, and Z. And then absolutely nothing happens. I mean, it's a question of there's political desire. I'm not sure if there's political will, and certainly capacity to do what needs to be done to fix the mess.
Yes, so South Africa, in broad terms, unless we look at the period of GEAR under Thabo Mbeki, South Africa consistently has prioritized prioritized redistribution above growth. Now, redistribution, given our legacy of apartheid and everything else, is hugely important. but we have an insufficient at a strategic level focus on growth. So there is a huge positive correlation between economic growth rates in South Africa and employment. And this graph shows the percent change in GDP growth in South Africa and employment growth. You and I will know that one of our major concerns in South Africa beyond extreme poverty is unemployment and inequality. You cannot change that if you do not grow the economy. But our focus in South Africa consistently, and it's for understandable reasons, has been on redistribution. So we have a massive social grants program. Excellent, does a huge amount of positive for South Africa. We need to deal with our legacy issues, but we need to grow the economy. And to grow the economy, we need, and Bruce, you know this better than anybody else, an agreement on the future of South Africa, and social compact, whatever you want to term it, that takes us to the future. And that we don't have. Business and government are often at odds. Certainly, it's much better under President Ramaphosa. And President Ramaphosa has been trying to undo the damage that has been done by Jacob Zuma. That's a long, long process. But I think from my perspective, one of the first things we need to do is to revisit the future of, what we need to relook the National Development Plan. The NDP, which is supposed to be our lodestar, is comprehensively outdated. Fantastic document. But, just to give you one example, the NDP said that South Africa will have 58.5 million people by 2030. We got there in 2019. We are going to have about 63.3 million people by 2030. That is a difference of 5 million people. It's a province. We really need to, the NDP had a growth target of 5.4%. That is completely crazy. We said now that, our expectations is about 2%. We have the potential by 2030 by getting to average rates of about 3%. The NDP says reduce inequality by 9 percentage points. We've exhausted our potential for social grants. Only growth in the formal sector eventually can reduce unemployment and inequality. So we really need to revise and rethink the National Development Plan and not set it as something written in stone, but revise it every 5 years and keep it as a running goal, and that South Africans can get behind a common vision using an updated National Development Plan. Bruce, you know that the original intent of the National Development Plan was not to design a development plan for South Africa. It was for Jacob Zuma to move Trevor Manuel out of the Treasury and park him somewhere where he couldn't obstruct him.
And Trevor Manuel was the last cheerleader that we had for the National Development Plan. And what the National Development Plan needs is a prefect or a drill sergeant, somebody with a little bit of authority, somebody who can go in from government department to government department and bash some heads together, because it needs, and it was just a little bit fluffy and a little bit wishy-washy and a little bit dreamy, quite frankly. You can't implement something that's a plan which isn't really a plan, which isn't a blueprint, but just really a hope and a wish and a goal. It started on a lousy premise, respectfully to Trevor Manuel.
Yeah, no, I mean, as I said, the intent with the NDP was political. It wasn't there. And the other thing that Jacob Zuma wanted is he wanted somebody to set out what ministers had to do so that he did not have to supervise them, and that they would then implement that. And he dismantled the imperial presidency that Thabo Mbeki had built and replaced it with a very effective monitoring and evaluation system. But there was no centralized management and execution. And one of the things that President Ramaphosa is struggling to do, but is doing, is to start to build the central monitoring and implementation coordination and capacity within the presidency. It's absolutely critical.
One of the big issues that is scaring a lot of people right now is the fact that South Africa is teetering on the brink of the fiscal cliff. We're peering over the very edge. We're looking down into the abyss. The abyss is littered with rocks and debris from floods, and we are desperately concerned that we're going to run out of money. And there's a very high chance that we do. We're downgraded in March, April last year, understandably, by even the most patient of our ratings agencies. Moody's, the ratings agency that for many years has hated us least, finally was forced to downgrade. And we've got government departments that don't seem to understand the seriousness of the problems that they face, and certainly a civil service that doesn't seem to understand the importance of the role it plays when it comes to a wage agreement. And I know this is stuff that's in the short term, but we won't have a long term unless we fix the short term.
Yeah, well, I think that the signs of an agreement and a way forward, both on civil service wages as well as on Eskom, are really positive. As well, maybe in the third instance with the Zondo inquiry and everything that is happening with the National Prosecuting Authority. But it's much easier to break things than it is to fix things. And President Ramaphosa came in, as we know, with a razor-thin majority. He's been struggling with Ismagashule and others, but he is winning that fight. And I think in a year or two's time, the situation will look quite different. But he embarked originally, Bruce, as you very well know, on a comprehensive effort of gaining foreign direct investment. But without regaining confidence in the South African economy by South Africans, and particularly by South African business, it will not work. The international community will invest when South Africans invest. And on your regular show, you consistently speak about South African business going to invest elsewhere. We are one of the largest investors in the rest of Africa. Africa, we are at the doorstep of the continent that is going to have the most rapid economic growth going forward. It is our natural market. We are heading for an African continental free trade area. All kinds of impressive stuff. We need to benefit from that. And to do that, the single most important thing is coherence between government and the private sector. Only the private sector at the moment, whether you like that or not, can make the South African economy grow. And as I've tried to indicate, without growing the formal sector of the economy, redistribution will not get us out of this hole.
The brand new edition of my book, which is due out in a week or two, he said, advertising his book on PSG's platform, makes that point exactly. I mean, whether you like it or not, the best ally government has got is the corporate sector. The corporate sector's biggest ally is government. And into that mix, you've got to then have labor, which buys into a vision that sometimes you just need to suck it up for the greater good. I wonder whether or not COVID-19 is potentially the catalyst for collaboration in a way that we've not seen in South Africa ever.
Well, I think that's what we're all hoping, and I think the signs are there. We are seeing movement. Perhaps the movement's never fast enough for to satisfy any of us. I know that. But COVID has been a reality check, I think, for much of South Africa and indeed the world. And we are seeing, I mean, what is happening around the wage agreements, formal public sector wage agreement. I don't think that would have happened in the absence of COVID. So hopefully COVID is giving South Africa a reality check. But we need labor to come to the table. And but more than anything else, we need a clear vision and plan and a implementation strategy that brings those two key components together, Bruce, that you mentioned, government and the private sector. That can grow South Africa out of this. There is no short-term magic bullet, silver bullet to any of this.
The question is, can we fix South Africa before it breaks irreparably?
I think we can. We often forget how resilient we are and what depths of despair we have gone through. None of us would want to go back to the 1980s and the 1990s with P.W. Botha and all of these kind of people. We forget how often how well it is going in South Africa. I do a lot of country forecasts where I travel to Tunisia, to Algeria, Angola, and so on. Every country, Ethiopia, Kenya, every country I go to believe that the world is a mess and that their country is specifically in absolutely the pits. And it's amazing. You come back to South Africa and say, actually, guys, it's not that bad. We are all struggling. I mean, we can just be thankful we don't have bloody Trump. So I think
nor does America anymore, which is a good and wondrous thing. But I mean, I wish we could have time to discuss parallels between Donald Trump and Jacob Zuma, but let's not bother going there. The point is that we often malign ourselves, we malign our prospects, we malign the future to our detriment. The trouble is, the longer a repair process takes, the more despondent people get. Many people watching us today are people going to be saying, but the future scares the living daylights out of me. Before we move on to an Africa view, just give me, let's wrap South Africa very briefly in terms of what it looks like. Big picture of South Africa. It's 2021. Let's go forward 20 years. You can go forward 30 years if you like. Those of us who will still be around then won't remember this conversation, so you can go wild. But yeah, South Africa 2050, pick a date.
Bruce, we need to fix the now, because many of the factors to South Africa today are driving our future. I'll give you one, and that is the extent of skilled outward migration and outward investment in South Africa. If we do not fix those two things and start attracting skilled inward migration, people with capital, we will not change our future. Every South African that I meet that has money or skills is trying to emigrate. We have to turn that around. We have to entice South Africans with money to come back, the international community. That requires an entire mindset change from the Department of Home Affairs, from DIRCO, from, and so on and so forth. So that partnership and what we do with our skilled outward migration and the efforts by South African business to go and invest in Australia and Sasol in the United States or whatever, we have to turn that around. If that is not the situation, South Africa, there is nothing like the country will fall apart. The country will we will struggle onwards. And I've written quite extensively on sort of different scenarios and where South Africa could go. We are not going to fall apart in some completely dismal way, but we have to arrest the downward trajectory. And that requires a focus on fundamentals. The reason why during GEAR South Africa worked is because under GEAR, Thabo Mbeki focused on a number of key issues. He didn't have a list of 20 priorities or 15 or 12 or whatever. He had 3 or 4. And that's what we really need to do. We need to get the fiscal situation under control and move forward on that basis. If we can do that, then South Africa in 20, 30 years could double our GDP per capita. We could become the engine of Southern Africa. We could do what we should be doing, what China is doing in Asia. China is doing its One Belt, One Road. Why are we not doing our South African One Belt, One Road? Because our future manufacturing and export destination, the only area where we have competitive advantage is Africa. We should be not opening up our borders, regulating, making sure that we have efficient bait bridges and everything else, and trade our way to the future. Every scenario we do on the long-term future of Africa indicates that the implementation of the free trade agreement, the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, has the most growth potential of any in terms of its contribution to growth. And that's where our future lies. We must grow South Africa into Africa and benefit from one of the largest markets that internationally and the only one where we have a competitive advantage. If we can do all of that, then South Africa in 10, 15, 20 years will be a very, very different place. To do that, we first need to come to terms of where we are and where we want to go and gain coherence amongst government, the private sector, and civil society.
Let's talk about the Africa opportunity. I mean, we look at the demographics of the African continent, a rapidly rising population, a very young population. The consultants will tell you that's the demographic dividend. Skeptics will tell you it's a demographic time bomb. Where do you sit on this sea change that is happening on the African continent?
Bruce, I'm going to share a screen again, just to give you a bit of context of the kind of work that we are doing, just because I want to situate my remark. So hopefully you can see an arrow going up. So we are doing an update on a series of scenarios on the long-term future of Africa. We look at the impact of a more rapid demographic transition. And I can speak a lot about the demographic dividend, because Africa is about 30 years away from its demographic dividend. We only get to it about 2050. Our population is so young that we cannot grow our quality in our labor force. We're looking at the impact of an achievable agricultural revolution, what impact that will have on Africa. What will the impact be of improved health outcomes and the rapid rollout of basic water and sanitation infrastructure? What would better education, particularly quality of education, provide for Africa? What would better stability mean for growth in Africa? What would a manufacturing transition be in terms of its impact? Historically, all countries that today are wealthy have got there through industrialization. Will Africa be different? What is the potential of leapfrogging and improved government effectiveness around using modern technology, particularly in electricity generation, to leapfrog Africa into the future? What is the impact of the continental free trade area? What would happen in terms of relieving the bulk infrastructure backlog in Africa? And NEPAD has got a program called PIDA, the Presidential Infrastructure Development Initiative, which is all about this. What is the role of external actors, remittances, foreign direct investment and aid? What is the contribution of better governance to Africa? And then we look at what is the impact of each of these scenarios in terms of climate change, carbon emissions, and the energy transition, and what is the impact on the future of work. And we measure the impact over, we're looking out till 2043 at the moment, impact of changes in poverty, GDP, and GDP per capita. If we do all of those scenarios, then this is the same kind of graph I showed earlier. This is for Africa as a whole. This is the contribution that each of those scenarios make to GDP per capita growth in Africa over quite a long time horizon. You can see second from the bottom, agriculture makes the largest contribution at a continental level. Of course, this is gross generalization. Africa has never tried an agricultural revolution. Different to India, different to China, different to Brazil. We talk about it, but we've never done it. The continental free trade area, leapfrogging and so on. So it depends where your country is, what of these scenarios contribute the most to growth. If, for example, on the left-hand side, I list all these scenarios, and then I divide Africa's countries between low-income countries. Africa's got 23 low-income countries. Low-middle-income countries. Africa's got 23 low-middle-income countries. And Africa now has only 6 upper-middle-income countries that include South Africa. We also have 2 higher-income countries, Seychelles and Mauritius. And you can see the one indicates which of these scenarios has the most positive contribution in growing GDP per capita. Agriculture has for low and low middle income countries, but for upper middle income countries, which include South Africa, it is the implementation of the free trade agreement. Second is leapfrogging for low and low middle income countries. And in the case of upper middle income countries, it is improvements in health and water and sanitation. And the third priority is then either stability, governance, or agriculture if an upper middle income country. So Africa's future is bright if Africa can undertake the same kind of structural transformations that Africa has. This is, for example, a graph that shows GDP per capita in Africa. The blue line is what it would have been without COVID. Then there's a solid green line that shows what is our current trajectory. You can see the impact of COVID on the future of Africa, on GDP per capita, and the dashed line shows in actual fact where we are. Africa as a whole will only recover back to 2019 average levels of income in about 2024, 2025. Such is the impact of COVID-19 on Africa. Not because of high levels of fatality or mortality, but because of the economic knock-on effects. So, our job in the forecasting world is not to predict the future, but to ask what needs to be done to change that future.
And it's actions. I mean, actions that are required. Africa is a highly attractive investment opportunity for the world. The trouble is, COVID-19 has exposed the cracks around the world of problems within countries and the governments have in their own backyards. And so much of the money that might have come towards Africa over the next 5, 10, 15 years is not going to be applied at home in many investor countries simply because they need infrastructure projects. They need to rebuild themselves, and charity begins at home, and that's where they're likely to start. Does that set us back a little bit in terms of our recovery?
You know, I will agree, but I also won't agree. There is a wall of money, particularly in the private sector, internationally, that is looking for high returns. The problem that we have is that the money in the West is all private sector money. So they want to know what the rating agencies do. And the rating agencies generally take a very punitive, negative view on Africa, much more so than any other continent. So you'd find that Ghana, for example, pays significantly more than any other South American country for its bonds. Whereas decisions by China to invest in Africa, it's a government decision. The Chinese Communist Party says we have real political interests, given that we've got problems with everybody else, and we will invest. And so the way your money comes from is a big factor. But the reality is that return on investment in Africa is higher than in any other continent in the world. It's a bit of high risk, high return, that is true. But the money, the spare money, lies in the US and in Europe at the moment still. China at the moment doesn't have that spare capital anymore that it used to have. We need to get, it's again going back to investor confidence and changing the narrative about Africa. And that unfortunately means that we need to change the stories about governance, also instability and so on. But that's really, I think, where we need to start.
And we also are very critical of the African continent as South Africans. We think we're a little bit superior. We think we're just a little bit better than everybody else. And we arrive around the African continent, and we think that we can teach local people a thing or two. And we've had South African companies have had their backsides kicked in numerous countries, the most recent of which Shoprite pulling out of Nigeria, for example.
Yeah, I've worked with the Organization of African Unity and the African Union for decades, and the arrogance of South African politicians, particularly the ANC, when it engaged with its peers, was absolutely breathtaking. We are held in quite high regard in the rest of Africa as a country that is diversified and has got lots of technology. But we really need, as South Africans, to get behind a common vision. We are so divided. We are so fighting with one another and getting ready to leave South Africa and not to invest and negative, that we are doing ourselves a significant amount of disservice. So I go back to this issue. We need a vision for South Africa. I know this vision thing, people get upset about it, but we need to say where we want to go and then act on it.
Clem Sunter was talking about for South Africa having a TRC for the economy, a TRC for the economic future of South Africa, get everybody around the table. And he was laughed at, scoffed at, and ignored. Imagine if we'd done it a decade ago, where we might be. It wasn't in Jacob Zuma's interests. He had other, sort of personal hobbies that he was pursuing. But for Cyril Ramaphosa, this could be the opportunity. It's shown to be successful in the crisis of COVID-19, of getting a more aligned vision for the future. Perhaps it's time to have a proper big discussion about the future.
I think it really is very necessary, but we need to have the discussion, but we need to cohere around a common vision where we want to go. And I think there's no difference between labor, capital, civil society about where we want to go. But as soon as you start talking about how the point of departure and the ideological framing, that the discussion becomes really fraught. And I think we in a sense need a kind of a technocratic discussion. And then we need to move forward on implementation. And implementation requires leadership from the presidency and a partnership with the private sector. And it's going to require some pain. If we look at our forecasts on poverty in South Africa and poverty in Africa and indeed globally, the reality is that for the next few years, the world is going to struggle. Poverty in Africa is going to increase, including in South Africa. But we need to take this crisis and to make something out of it. And Africa remains the one area where the opportunity for investment is larger than it is anywhere else in the world.
When we look at the Millennium Development Goals, and for decades, all the way from the 1960s, globally, average poverty has been decreasing. And we've seen dramatic turnarounds in those industrializing countries that you spoke about, the South Koreas, the Chinas, and those where average global poverty has been in sharp and consistent decline for a long time. 2020 becomes the first year in probably 5 decades where average global poverty begins to pick up. And I would argue it's probably been more accentuated on this continent and certainly in this country than in many parts of the world.
So what we have there is a forecast of poverty in millions of people in Africa on the left-hand side. And at the bottom, we have time from 2018 till 2030. Now, the Sustainable Development Goal 1 is for the world to eliminate extreme poverty by 2030. The rest of the world will achieve that, but sub-Saharan Africa will be probably, well, if you look at this forecast, there will probably be between 500 and 520 million Africans that will still be living in extreme poverty. Now, Africa at the moment's got a population of about 1.3 billion people. By 2030, Africa will have a population of about 1.7 billion people. So poverty rates will slowly start coming down. But in actual fact, in 2020, the impact of COVID was such that it added 31 million Africans to extreme poverty rates. This year, we expect that number to an additional 42 million people to be classified as extremely poor. Next year, about 24 million. So that by the end of 2030, when the international commitment is to reduce poverty to zero, we will have about 522 million Africans still in extreme poverty. So poverty in Africa will go from about 35%, which is what it was in about 2019, to about either 31 or 29%. The two are either the current path or the COVID scenario. So when we speak of poverty going forward, we are going to be largely speaking about sub-Saharan Africa. But because we have a large, growing and a young population, it also provides huge opportunity in terms of growing. And you know, there's no secret to what what Africa needs to do. It's the same as with South Africa. We need to improve productivity, move labor and capital from a low productivity sector to a higher productivity sector. We need to grow the formal sector. And this is, you know, what Africa needs to do, what every African leader is trying to do, and what South Africa needs to do.
Is it a country-by-country project, or is it an African Union-led project? I mean, how do we achieve these big and lofty goals? Because you and I can talk about it, we can nod wisely and go, oh yeah, no, that's exactly what we need. And then we can go back and go and have some lunch or whatever we're going to do next and expect it just to happen. And it doesn't just happen. It's not.
No, it doesn't.
There's no Harry Potter magic wand here.
No, I mean, South Africa has got our myth, the National Development Plan 2030. The Africa Union has got its myth, Agenda 2063. And we are looking at modeling what is possible. Very often, these are blue skies analysis. It is where we want to be. Where we want to be is very different to what is possible and what can be done with real commitment. It is eventually a country by country leadership and commitment that changes things, not the setting out of goals. The setting of goals and the coherence around where we want to go is an important first step, but it is the implementation and the commitment by top leadership. Whether countries grow is not determined whether they are democratic or not. It is determined by the growth orientation of the governing elite. And particularly if you're a low-income country. If you're in a high-income country, then there is a correlation between democracy and growth, but not at low levels of income. What we need are leaders that are really committed. And the only two countries that have done exceptionally well, Rwanda and Ethiopia, they are exceptions, but they both suffered a trauma: the genocide in Rwanda and the red terror in Ethiopia. And that trauma created a vision and a commitment towards growth that is quite unique in the continent.
Why do we have to go through a trauma? I mean, you could argue that COVID-19 could be used as that trauma, that moment, that catalyst, because if we fail to use it, potentially we head into some real trauma. I mean, you've got to be blind not to notice the expansion of informal settlements, the expansion of poverty, the queues at SASSA, for example, in the short term, and all of these sorts of pressures. And you've got to look at South Africa's balance sheets and say, once social grants start drying up, and if we get to that sort of scenario, then we go towards a potential trauma, and we simply cannot afford it.
No, no country needs to go to that kind of trauma. The Second World War, whatever. We don't need that. What we need in Africa is we need substantive democracy. We look at democracy and we measure democracy, the relative levels, and I make a very specific point about substantive democracy. What we have in Africa is we have what we refer to as electoral democracy, where you go through the motions, let's say Zimbabwe, Uganda, and other countries, but that democracy does not translate into accountability. Africa is quite democratic by global standards. In actual fact, if you measure democracy in Africa, Africa has, we refer to it as that it has a democratic surplus. Countries are more democratic than you would expect given their levels of development. So that democratic surplus actually translates into a degree of, sometimes, if you're a low-income country, slow growth. If you're an authoritarian leader and you have a clear vision and you implement that right, you can grow more rapidly. But 99% of Africa's poor democracies have poor leadership and don't grow. So what needs to be done is relatively clear. And I think that Africa, and you see that with every passing year, there are more elections, the elections are more credible, more leaders are elected and they are more accountable. And you see changes in government, well, here and there, maybe. And there's no magic about this. It is about determined, clear leadership that provides a clear direction of where it wants to go and implements that, and that is held to account.
2040, 2050, 2060. Paint the picture. The best case scenario. Well, maybe let's not get la land about this. Paint for me a likely picture of what South Africa looks like within the African continent in 2050, based on what we know right now.
South Africa can be and should be a growth engine of Southern Africa. We are the industrial hub, we have the money, we have the technology, and we have particularly the high-end services that can help the rest of the continent. So I hope to see by 2030, 2040, a regionally integrated market in sub-Saharan Africa where borders are crossed seamlessly, where we trade with one another, where we are firstly and primarily, our entire manufacturing and services industry is orientated towards the rest of Africa. Opportunities are massive. We serve as a gateway to Southern Africa, and where South Africa serves as a point of attraction for foreign capital and foreign investors. When the Chinese gang up on Hong Kong, they've already done it, but then the people from Hong Kong come to South Africa. They invest here. They don't go to Britain. But we don't seize these opportunities. So we need to change the narrative. We have the nature, we have not only the natural endowment, but South Africa has got a visibility internationally that is quite remarkable. We need to change that. And we can only change that if we change our own narrative on ourselves. So the negative storylines that the whole time we share with one another about how bad it is and crime and I don't know what else, we need to get behind a vision that changes that and that we can all buy into. And in that vision, South Africa 10, 20, 30 years from now could be a remarkable place. We consistently do not remember how well we live in South Africa. I travel a lot. I can promise you that we have this vision that the grass is greener on the other side. The grass is brown and there's no grass. So.
Jakkie Cilliers, we'll leave it there. Thank you very much. Falona, back to you. Jakkie Cilliers, thanks very much.
Thank you, Bruce and Jakkie, for the valuable insight and forecast into the future. I think my biggest takeaway for me is that even though we are living in uncertain times currently, the outlook for South Africa and Africa as a whole is most certainly bright if we are able to successfully implement initiatives such as Tuma Mina, as well as the concept of Ubuntu across Africa with a common vision. A skilled and trusted financial advisor can be invaluable during these uncertain times. They can provide objective insights and help you consider alternative scenarios so you can make considered, rational decisions on your wealth and insurance portfolios. If you have an advisor, I encourage you to engage with them. And if you don't, then please get in touch with us. We welcome your feedback, so please communicate with us and be sure to register for our next exciting speaker in the Think Big series.